All right, welcome, folks, to the Jung and the Restless. Uh, that's Jung over there, and which I suppose makes me the Restless. So,
Absolutely.
yeah. Um, first of all, Matt, I thought that something that was funny would be was the listener feedback that we got from our nieces and maybe from your daughter. Um,
Yeah, we get the reviews are in from episode 1 of our podcast. And my 11-year-old daughter called it super awkward. And my 8-year-old said, I sound like a robot reading from a script. So if you're into that, then this is the podcast for you.
yeah,
Um, and so I haven't, I'm a classic over explainer. People are always telling me that I'm explaining too much, that I talk too much. In reality, I never connect the dots for anyone. That's a fun game that I like. I like to just say things and then let people play the game of trying to figure out what the hell I meant by that. So we just started this podcast, Nate and I, um, because we were having these phone conversations for sometimes hours at a time on a regular basis, like, every few weeks, maybe once a month. And when I began the process of sort of journaling my thoughts or writing down my thoughts, um, it was like, well, why don't we just talk these out and record it for anybody that wants to listen, or for future, that we can go back and revisit. So the format basically is just Nate and I talking like we normally do about the most important topics that we can think of, which is kind of where we live anyway. So for those of you who may be listening or may be joining us, we're just, Nate and I are just wandering down this path of meaning and life's big questions, and bouncing ideas and thoughts back and forth. And so we wanted to bring other people into this who we know are thinking about these things too. So that's our thought process. And the name is kind of funny, but Carl Jung is my personal hero. I tend to make, no matter what we're talking about, I tend to make it about Carl Jung in some way, shape, or form. Um,
Carl Jung
so
is to you as Teddy Roosevelt is to me,
100%,
perhaps.
100%. Yeah. So that's basically the premise behind this idea. There's probably going to be some hopefully some funny stuff that we put on Instagram. But for those of you who want to hear the full conversation, we're putting this podcast on YouTube and Apple and Spotify.
Yeah. So Matt, I thought that um, our niece Hannah's feedback was pretty funny. So our sister Amanda was like, "Hey, Hannah thought this was hilarious, especially the awkward silences." And I honestly was like, "There were awkward silences," and
Well,
it brought me back to that. It brought me back to that conversation that I think you were telling me about between a 9 and a 5, um, where they were the 9 and the 5 were talking and they were like, yeah, how could we be any more perfect for each other? Neither of us will ever infringe on the other's boundaries
right,
or pressure the other person to do anything.
right.
So we just
The
sit there in silence.
nines and fives have zero expectations for each other. So there's no bar, there's no standard.
Yeah.
Plus the fact that, well, Hannah, let's be clear here. Hannah embellished our awkward pauses on the video, and she did it for clout. She wanted clicks and she wanted followers on social media. However, you're just the other part is you're just used to the awkward silences. Anyone who's talked to me on the phone ever will become quickly accustomed to just looking at the phone to see if there's anyone on the other end.
Yeah. Yeah. And at this point, honestly, the silences aren't super awkward for me because, so I was telling you before we started recording, I haven't left the house in 4 days except to buy groceries and to take Haystack for a walk. And so, you know, because I'm trying to finish this research. So I'm like, hey man, this is some really invigorating conversation.
I wish you had a time lapse video of you sitting at that desk when that plant was like really small, and like you're just working and you're wearing the same shirt, and the plant just grows to full size.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, anyway, we can go down the plant road someday. But basically, so what I tried, well, one, Matt really leveled up last week because you had those Coach Prime posters, and I was like, dang, I gotta find something good, and I don't want you all to see like my home behind me. So I was like, let me just show off my plants, and then Matt showed up with a blank wall today. But yeah, these are my plants. But because I'm trying to finish this research, I was like, how can I remind myself that I'm alive? I was going to actually record outside today, but it's raining. So I just had to bring my plants in anyway. And I just parked myself in front of a window. All right. So Matt, let's talk about vocation. Yeah. So we talk about a sense of calling or a sense of purpose. And let me take a step back and say the reason why we talk about this, you and I, is because one, there's like such interesting psychological intersections that you can speak to. And on my end, this is kind of the focus of my research, is on vocation and calling and how that what those experiences are. And so Matt threw me a softball this week and said, let's just talk about vocation. So that's what we're going to do. Yeah. So I think where I'm at in this process, Matt, is that typically when we talk about vocation or sense of calling, one, most people don't actually know what to do with it, but they can describe it. However, they can't define it, which is kind of like this is like a terrible analogy, but there was like this I can't remember what Congress was dealing with, but they were trying to define like what's really harmful music back in like the early 90s, where they had to put labels on CDs, and they were like, well, you can't really define it, but you know it when you see it.
Right. I think that was like Nancy Reagan.
Yes, it was no, Tipper Gore.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's better.
Yeah, that's 8th grade social studies curriculum.
But Nancy Reagan went up against like Motley Crue or somebody like that.
Yeah, and prevailed
100%.
Or because her cause was righteous.
Thank God for Nancy Reagan.
Indeed.
We want her on that wall, and we need her on that wall.
So when we talk about a sense of vocation or a sense of calling, yeah. So we typically just assume that it's kind of like for I don't know, like ministers, right? Like you're called to this kind of work. Or two, we like assume it's like this galactic sized purpose. Like, well, maybe this is why I'm here. This is my fate. And for the folks that I deal with, which are mostly in the helping profession, so that's like teachers, healthcare professionals, ministers, nonprofit leaders, the two questions that they almost always ask immediately are, how do I know what my calling is? And two, am I like doing it? Am I living out my calling? And those are good questions, but those are completely let me say it this way. Those are the least interesting questions that you could ask when you talk about a sense of calling. Um, the most interesting question that you can ask is, who am I as a called person? So we tend to have this like this notion of calling as a thing, or whether you want to call it fate. Matt, what does Jung call it? The daimon.
Well,
right?
the daemon.
Yeah,
I don't know how you pronounce it in Latin,
yeah.
but that was Socrates,
Mm.
who had so Jung is referring to Socrates's daemon, who Socrates consulted, his inner an inner voice that Socrates listened to
That's it.
and consulted basically for every major life decision.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have this like idea typically that my calling or my fate or my purpose is out there waiting for me. And I've just got to like kind of eventually arrive at it. But what I think is really cool about the way that the ancient Greeks talk about this as a daimon is that the way they understand it is this, a very general version. So before you were born, before you were brought into this world, your soul has had an identity. It has a DNA, an imprint, like an acorn, a seed. And at birth, you forgot all of it. It was all lost. And your soul chose, it elected your body and your family to carry out the purpose of whatever that purpose or that DNA, that acorn said it was supposed to, how it was supposed to live.
Interesting.
So you arrive in the world and you've forgotten everything the moment you're born. Your daimon is your guide back to yourself. Your daimon is what whispers in your ear and guides you through life toward or into your purpose always. So it's not like you're born and, maybe there'll be like this, like in the Bible, it's Esther, right? That she like lives her whole life and maybe she was, created for such a time as this. But
right.
in this telling of it, you're like always being guided into it by this voice. And so there are a couple of implications. One is that when you think about the idea that you chose your body and your family, your soul chose those as the best vehicles to achieve the acorn DNA inside of you, to live out your purpose. So they're actually your choosing. You just didn't know it. And your daimon over time is whispering in your ear, telling you why or how. And then two, that it's, and I think Jung goes on to talk about this, that it's those that, while that may sound wild, it's actually those that don't listen to their daimon or repress it that are the ones that develop these kind of like
Pathologies.
pathologies. I think he calls them neuroses.
Neuroses, yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, that's what I'm buried in right now. And I think that's really interesting, is this idea you've got an imprint when you're born. And it's no mistake it's no mistake or no coincidence. The body that you're born into, the family that you're born into, your soul actually chose those. It elected those forms.
Right.
You just can't remember why, because you forget it all when you come into the material world.
Yeah, well, it's interesting that from that premise that we, as whether it's Westerners or North Americans, have sort of funneled that whole idea into like what job should I do? And that the idea of, your soul mapping out your life and your circumstances, and then we turn that into, well, what should I do to make money? And like that's the only question. Maybe it's not the only question, but it's like the first question that we ask ourselves when we start thinking about the idea of calling. The other interesting, well, there's a couple of thoughts, because coming from um from my religious background, I know um a couple of teachers who would say that they would consult the spirit for basically everything. Like, and even, I mean, it was primarily to ask the spirit about major decisions, like, what should I do for a living? Or, who should I marry? Where should I live? Um, but you would basically practice listening to those answers by just asking the spirit everything. Like, what should I wear today? Or what should I have for breakfast? So that in the same way that Socrates asked his daemon those big questions, but it was a way of getting in the habit and recognizing, learning how to hear the answer, so that when the big question comes up, this is not the first time I've consulted the voice inside my head. Eckhart Tolle, um, who wrote The Power of Now, he says the key to being content in your circumstances, even if your circumstances are awful, is to not pretend, but imagine, tell yourself that you chose those circumstances. So in the same way that maybe Socrates, and I don't know if Plato would have aligned, or how he would or wouldn't have aligned with that premise, but
The premise
basically,
comes from Plato, and Socrates is the one who advances it, I think.
okay, because Plato, yeah, and he would put forth, he would put forward a number of premises, and you're like, which one is the one you're endorsing, Plato, or are you giving it to Socrates, or are you just anyway?
Yeah.
But it's fun. It's interesting that would be Eckhart Tolle's key to alleviating suffering and coming coming out from under the burden of your circumstances, is to look at those circumstances as if you chose them. So now you take a sort of an empowered look at your own life. Hey, this is what I created for myself. This is not being imposed on me. This is what I chose. And if you take it all the way down to the ground of to the bottom level, we do have a lot to do with exactly where we are. So that's an interesting premise, and it has interesting implications.
Yeah. Well, I think going back to a couple of things here. The first one is going back to your, like, the conversation around career and calling. So in my participant interviews, um, I can't remember how many, but out of, let's say a dozen, out of a dozen participants that I had to do interviews with, I think there were something like 46 different careers that they would, at some point in the conversation, in the interview, say that they were called to.
Hmm.
Um, And I never asked. That wasn't one of the research questions, was what career do you feel called to? I never like explicitly asked that, but they would gravitate toward that question as if that was the natural outcome, was some kind of a career.
Right.
And if you hold that side by side to this platonic idea that you have a daimon in your ear guiding you, guiding your soul, uh, like toward its ultimate purpose, how silly does it sound to say like, well, I think my calling is to find this certain, this specific career.
Right.
It's like how much could we possibly shortchange what's actually happening with us? And
Yeah.
yeah, and one, like whether or not you believe that like I don't think anyone's arguing that the daimon it exists as like it's not sitting on your shoulder, right? But
Hmm.
it's an image or a metaphor for a lived experience, right? It's a way of talking about a human experience, which is that we are called, or sometimes we feel compelled toward a certain thing that we can't not do, and we don't know why.
Yes.
Um,
And
and
that's where Jung comes into the conversation,
yeah,
is because he's looking at that daimon as a universal. It's an archetype. Like we all have that. Whether
archetypes. That's it. Yeah,
whether you call it the still small voice, or you call it the daimon, or you call it the Holy Spirit, or you call it God,
or your conscience.
or you call it your conscience, or maybe Freud might call it the superego. You have an internal voice that is directing you most times, and whether not in it's not a universal direction. It's specific to each individual. But you said it doesn't matter if you call it your daimon, or it doesn't matter if you call it your the voice inside your head. It acts on you as if it were God, as if it were the voice of the Holy Spirit.
As if it were a law from God unto itself.
That's it. And that's the quote.
Yes.
And so back to that neuroses. If you resist, or you go in conflict with that calling, with that voice, with that directing spirit, then it begins to present a problem for you internally. You run into internal conflict, and sometimes you run into external conflict too. But primarily, fundamentally, the conflict becomes internal, and you become neurotic, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's an interesting. All right. So there are two ways to talk about that. Well, there are multiple ways, but two helpful ways to talk about it are, there's a sociological way of talking about it and a psychological way. Right. So
Mm-hmm.
so Jung is talking about it psychologically, as a psychological factor. Um, both both are going to talk about it in ways that are value neutral. In other words, they're not saying whether it's good or bad. So somebody could follow their daimon or their voice and end up making really destructive decisions for the world. Right? It's completely value neutral. It's just a human experience. Um, your sociology of religion um, is built around Max Weber, who makes this really interesting argument that I think you and I have talked about before, that uh, that in America our sense of calling has been consumed or subsumed under a capitalist framework, that has been appropriated. And the way he talks about it is this: so you go back to your pilgrims and your Puritans, man. Um, your Puritans, your early Calvinists in America, like like early and mid 17th century.
Mm-hmm.
They land in America, and Calvinists believe that God predestines people uh, for either salvation or damnation.
Right.
And so, well, how do you know which one you are? Well, the evidence is going to be in your good works. So when we talk about a Protestant work ethic, what we're really talking about is a Protestant need to demonstrate the salvation of the individual by producing good works. In other words,
Right.
yes, of course I'm predestined because look at how great I am, or how look at the good things I'm doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so over time, as America secularizes, and as capitalism, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th century, um, becomes its own global force, that the idea moves from I need to produce good works to show that I'm saved to, as you're calling, to I need to produce for the sake of production. So we've commodified our sense of calling, and now it's like the ultimate expression of my calling is a career rather than good works to demonstrate my election, my salvation.
Right. That's interesting. Well, you can imagine an early American Calvinist settler pilgrim coming to the New World and applying that work ethic, or applying that um, that engine for productivity to the land, to farming,
Yep.
to city building, to trade, and for a religious motivation. I'm essentially trying to show my community that I'm part of the elect. But then the byproduct is resource acquisition. All of a sudden, because I plowed my field so diligently, and I built my cabin so thoughtfully, all of a sudden my crops are growing, my settlement is flourishing, my homestead is expanding. And then it's like, oh, well, yeah. And obviously you could probably trace this back further to Europe, but it probably became um, exaggerated, multiplied in the American colonies, because it was a new land, a new opportunity. And then all of a sudden, it's almost it's sort of commodified. This work ethic, it becomes sort of an American capitalist work ethic, and no longer a religious, and no longer just religious fervor.
Yeah, and it moves from you nailed it. It moves from the communal or the collective to the individual over time, which is also a capitalist idea, right? Is that each individual is a producer.
Yes.
And we talk about the American dream. It's really the capitalist dream, which is I as myself can show up and make something of myself. But the way that like Max Weber talks about this transformation is that when the Puritans get to America, they arrive in a continent in which they are obviously the vast minority, and they see themselves as being using that biblical term, a city on a hill. So their election is their selection by God is obvious from their standpoint, because they're going to be a shining city on the hill across the Atlantic back to Europe, and also to the Native Americans that they
Yeah, the New
view
World.
as unsaved and, barbaric. But what happens, a couple of generations later, when you look around and everybody is like you? You've done it, right? So is everybody then elected? Is everybody selected or predestined by God? So then you've got to move from the community into the individual. And now I've got to differentiate myself because I'm in a homogenous community as far as I can see.
Yeah. You're no longer attempting to differentiate your community.
Yeah.
From the external world. You're trying to differentiate yourself from the community.
That's right. Because we've expanded and we've succeeded, we've cleared the land and built new towns. And now everywhere I look, all of these other towns are doing the same thing. So am I really a city on a hill? Because I'm not any different than they are. So now the individual has to differentiate themselves. And they do that by productivity.
Yes.
And also by adhering to strict moral guidelines, like, what is it? You don't gamble, you don't dance, you don't drink, all that stuff. These are also the same folks that that perpetrated the Salem witch hunts, by the way.
Right. Well, it's really easy to be more Christian than the natives.
Yeah. Yes.
But then once you've surrounded yourself with Puritans, all of a sudden you've got to up the ante, the holiness ante, and really prove your election.
Yeah. It's much easier to meet your own moral guidelines that you didn't tell your neighbors that they needed to meet.
Yes.
Right. So it's way easier for me to be like, yeah, I'm meeting the moral guidelines that I set, and they're not, but also they don't know that they're supposed to do that.
Yeah, but also they don't know about the moral guidelines, and don't tell them.
Yeah, and don't tell them, because then how will I know?
Yeah. Yeah. But you can see how quickly the idea of calling, or the idea of that inner voice, the idea of that spirit leading you, gets subsumed under the paradigm of American capitalism and American productivity. So very quickly it becomes, what job am I called to do? And that's where it gets weird. That's why it's weird for me. And that's why the question is weird for a lot of people, because it's like, why does God, let's just put it in the God context. Why does God have a specific job for me? And even if my faith and my spirituality or my religious background is casual, or if you say I'm spiritual but not religious, or even if you say if you're devout, why is it that I don't have a calling in these other areas of my life, but this one, like when I'm 22 or whatever it is, or 18, when I'm picking my major, I've got to find this calling, and I've got to figure out how to. That's why I think the waters get muddied, and why it gets weird for people to try to navigate this conversation, and then to further complicate, you say, well, what about God's not going to call anybody to clean bathrooms, or God's not going to call, and then you start picking out all the jobs that need to be done that you can't imagine God calling you to do, because the calling conversation has been taken so far out of context and subsumed into the career,
the capitalist framework.
Framework.
Yeah. with and that's how do I say this? With the progress throughout the 20th century, well, let me take a step back. It only works if you have something or somebody to compare yourself with or to. So
Hmm.
the Puritans are looking, when they get here, they're looking collectively and they're looking out at the wilderness. They're looking back across the Atlantic at these like immoral denominations and immoral Catholic institutions, um, and then they kind of tame the wilderness around them, right, in the immediate. And what happens after that? Well, we enter into a phase of manifest destiny, where we look at the rest of the continent and we say God is calling us now to take on the rest of the continent, to civilize, right? And so we push westward. And that ends, right? I think the official close of the frontier is around 1890, 1892, something like that, which a few years later is going to coincide, let's say, whatever it is, 25 years later we're going to see the rise of communism, right? And so where the 19th century ends with the closing of the frontier, the 20th century begins and offers us somebody new to compare ourselves to. Now it's the communists.
Okay.
Right. So so capitalism becomes even more aligned with a sense of like Christianity, or a sense of God's, God's choice of systems, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's that's the Cold War, is that God is on the side of the Americans and the capitalists, because we have democracy and because we have a free market. And so now being a productive American takes on new meaning. It is now even more so a calling
Yeah.
than it ever has been. And it also becomes more, I would say, it becomes more meaningless, um, more personally meaningless.
Yeah. Because people because you can go back further. I mean, you can go as far back as recorded history, and there are people who feel called to take on roles. People who feel called to join a monastery, people who feel called to be a nun, people who feel called to be a priest or a missionary. I mean, go back to Jonah, where Jonah's called to go to Nineveh. But the real shift is now you have people, well, I feel called to the business world. Putting it in those terms, as opposed to like, I need to get a job. You say, I feel called to the business world. And it's hard to orient yourself to that language. Like, what do you mean when you say that? And what should you, is what you're saying real? Are you really, is like God calling you to business? I'm not saying that that's not an experience that people are having. I'm just saying, like, how do we fit that? What people are saying today does not fit into the historical context of how people experience that in the ancient world, and all the way up to the pre-modern turn of the century.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. So when we talk about being like you use the example of being called to the business world. So I would say that one of the defining factors of vocation or a calling is that it involves some kind of sacrifice, um, some form of it has to cost you something.
Okay.
And that's part of why it, like Jung talks about it as, that's part of why Jung talks about it as an irrational factor. So it would be like, I mean, look at, I don't know, look at Mother Teresa, right? I don't know what Mother Teresa could have been, but she probably could have chosen a life that was more comfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where she was, surrounded by, all the resources that she needed to feel, like to serve all of her needs. But she makes this choice. It comes at an expense. There's a cost to it in order for her to follow her calling. She's got,
Mm-hmm.
She's living on the streets of Calcutta with, the sickest of the sick and the poorest of the poor. And so when we talk about like things that we may feel called to in the world, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is this costing me? What's the expense or the sacrifice? Like Jung talks about it as saying that it's the irrational factor that acts as a law of God, like a law of God. But he says this is really interesting, that a defining factor is that it separates the person from the herd, from the well-trodden paths and safety of the herd. What he's saying is it costs you something.
Mm-hmm.
There's a risk involved. And
right.
yeah, and so when we talk about being called to a career, that may be true, but it's hard to imagine talking about being called to a certain career in the same terms as Jung is talking about a thing that acts as a law of God unto itself that separates you from the safety of the majority and places you at risk somehow.
Okay, so fundamentally, if we're thinking about a calling, then we're talking about a direction, a path, a choice, a move that you wouldn't make otherwise.
Yes, that's it.
So a calling is not something that you like were already going to do. I know that sounds silly, but like if you were already going to do it, then you wouldn't need to be called.
Right.
Like
yeah, that's right.
It has to be something that is off of your it has to be like the burning bush where Moses is on his way to Laban. Is that who, or is that Jacob and Esau?
That's Jacob and Esau, bro.
Who's Moses's father-in-law? Nick Saban, Laban. I don't know.
His wife is Zipporah. Japheth.
No.
Are you sure? Are you sure?
You're not sure. Not at all.
Okay.
Moses is on his way.
Jethro.
I think Jethro. Yeah. He's on his way from Egypt. He's escaping Egypt to, I don't, why am I adding details that I'm not confident in?
No, this is good. Keep going. Our nieces are learning something.
And he sees out of the corner, he's going across the desert, and he sees out of the corner of his eye the burning bush, a bush that's on fire, but it's not being consumed. And he has to go off his path to investigate and to see what this is. And there he hears the voice of God. So he's called off of his current path. Like if he was just going to his destination, that's not by definition a calling. A calling has to be taking you somewhere that you wouldn't have gone on your own. Some other force is calling you, like a shepherd and a sheep. The shepherd calls, the sheep would just lay around and eat grass, and the shepherd calls, the sheep to come which direction it wants to go. So initially, to even identify your experience as some sort of calling. It has to be a pull towards something you weren't going in a direction you weren't already going to go. And that's where the sacrifice element comes in, because going on a different path than you had planned on is going to involve some kind of sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's going to cost you something, but this is what you're saying is puts the modern claim in an interesting context. So if you say, well, I feel called to business. I feel called to the business world, which a lot of I've heard many times from evangelicals. Well, then, and you put the only reason you would say that is because so many people from your community are going into full-time ministry or whether in some capacity or another. And so you say, well, I feel, and that's obviously validated for a number of reasons. Well, it's a high calling to go into the ministry. Well, instead of just saying, well, I'm going to go get a job, you say, I feel called to the business world, because ordinarily what I would have done is I would have gone into ministry. But no, I feel called off of my path toward ministry toward business. Does that make sense? Like,
It does.
where like for historically it's the opposite, where just everybody either works on the farm or trades, or you some sort of craftsman, you sell something, and you have this experience of calling, and you say, oh, I'm going to give my life to the lepers in Calcutta. But in the last 20 years, now you say, well, everybody's, the normal thing to do for someone who's as zealous as I am about my faith would just be to go into the ministry. But alas, I feel called to go into business. And I'm not mocking that experience. I'm just saying it's vastly different than the traditional experience.
Yeah. And so when we talk about this sense of sacrifice, right? One of the less explored areas of vocation is the way that it intersects with a sense of grief or loss.
Mm-hmm.
That I found incredibly compelling. And so there's a quote by Frederick Buechner, who that's often used by, like, for instance, my students to talk about your calling. That it's something like your calling is the place where the world's deep hunger and your deep gladness meet. Right. But I was listening to another podcast called NetView, the Network of Vocation Undergraduate Education, and they had a guest, Dina Thompson, on there who reframed that and said, what if it's where your deep sadness and the world's deep hunger meet? And she talks about it in the sense of the vocations we do not choose. The argument that she's making is like, for a lot of us, we become aware of that deep hunger in the world because that deep hunger destroyed part of our lives. right? Um, uh, this is the parent who loses a child to cancer and realizes how few resources there are for parents whose children get terminal cancer diagnoses, and says, for the rest of my life, I'm going to devote myself to making sure that no parent ever has to go through this experience alone.
Right.
Their sense of calling will forever be linked with a sense of grief or a sense of loss.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've got like one of my best friends. Um, uh, she was she and her aunt are her aunt is the minister of a church in Orlando, and she was down there. She was working there at the time as well, and during the Pulse nightclub shootings, where almost 50 people were murdered in the nightclub in the middle of the night because they were in a gay nightclub.
Mm-hmm.
And the anniversary was just a few months back, and I was like listening, just listening to her talk about it, about that experience, because she was there that weekend that it happened, and their church was just a couple of blocks down the road, and so their church became kind of like the hub of the recovery effort.
Mm-hmm.
And and has become like kind of sort of like a flagship church down there. Um, and so for the anniversary every year, there are just like hundreds of people that come down to Orlando to meet with survivors and survivors' families every year to commemorate and make sure that it's not forgotten. And they like devote their lives to this thing. And yet it's also a thing that was so incredibly and continues to be traumatic for them.
Right.
And so while we think about a calling as like this thing that's going to fulfill me, it's also for many folks linked to a sense of loss. And I think that's part of where the sacrifice, that like, what is it costing you? Part of where that conversation comes in, is that it actually doesn't take you further away from your human experiences, right? Like in the Christian context, we think like, yeah, I'm called to ministry and it's out there and I've got to go discern what this thing is so I can finally arrive at it. As if it's going to like save you from yourself, right? As
Right.
if you're Saul on the road to Damascus and your calling is going to be this light that flashes and blinds you. And now you're an entirely new person and you don't have to like live in the old self anymore. But I would say your calling takes you deeper into that self. It doesn't
Right.
like save you from that. It actually brings you further into those experiences. So anyway, I think that's like incredibly compelling. Like I was talking to a college student once who felt a calling to ministry in the days after her sister took her own life. And she had an experience in the hospital room, with a chaplain and with a couple of her family members, and was like, I need to do this. And so she's talking to me about what this experience is like for her. And she says her calling, this is the way she described it. I'm going to paraphrase, but it was like it's like walking in a deep forest, and you never actually find your way out. You just become more comfortable walking in the darkness.
Hmm.
I mean, who talks about their calling that way, right? That's not a capitalist framework for a calling. That's not even typically how we talk about it in a Christian context.
Right.
But her calling was not taking her out of the forest. Her calling was actually bringing her further into it.
Yeah. Well, if you think about it psychologically, and this has spiritual implications too, but what, okay, let's reframe this. You've got this let's just say you've got this daimon, you've got this inner voice, you've got the voice of the spirit, you know, it could be the voice of the unconscious, but you've got this voice speaking to you and trying to guide you, trying to keep you on the higher path toward your true self, let's just say, for lack of a better word. What could possibly be a better sort of kicking down the door to access that voice than some period of grief? So that voice
Absolutely.
has been, so if you think about it this, I think about it this way, that voice has been speaking to you, let's just say from a Platonic standpoint, that voice has been guiding you from the beginning. That spirit, that angel chose your parents for you and has been speaking to you from the beginning, but you weren't in touch with that spirit. You weren't connected with that voice. You couldn't hear that voice until something, not, it doesn't have to be traumatic, but until grief sets in, until you lose something. And then all of a sudden you go, what is that voice? What is that? You say something is speaking to me. And it's like, yeah, well, that's been speaking to you this whole time, but it took the loss of something important in order for you to get in touch with that voice. And then all of a sudden you feel called. Whereas you've been a called person. You are a called person, but you didn't identify yourself in those terms until you lost something meaningful. And now all of a sudden that part of you comes alive and you go, oh, I found my calling. And it's not necessarily because some tragedy caused God to speak to you. God's been speaking to you, but you just weren't in touch with it. You've been in the forest. Like you were already in the forest.
Yeah.
But then something tragic happens and it causes you to let go of, all of these, whatever you're holding on to, and to look around and you go, whoa, I'm in the forest here. I'm in the darkness. And this is where I'm supposed to be. Like I'm here and now I realize I'm supposed to be here. I'm quote unquote called to be here.
That's it. Yeah. It's Paul Tillich, I think, that says, suffering takes us beneath the beneath the routines of life. And again, we're not making just to clarify, we're not making a causation argument here. Right.
Right.
Yeah. But it's, and this is universal. Like we can all identify with this, that at some point when we were going through something difficult, right, that we were able to understand a part of our lives differently afterwards.
Yes.
It's that simple. And I think for anybody that's ever, ask a teacher, right? Any teacher that's ever been like, I decided to become a teacher. Usually you have, for your great teachers, you have like two answers, right? One is either I had this amazing teacher and I wanted to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to be that person for somebody else. The other answer is I wanted to make sure that no student fell through the cracks like I did. Right.
Yeah.
that I had a hard time in high school, or I had a hard time in middle school, or you fill in the blank, and I decided that I wanted to be the person I wish I had. Anybody that's ever said those words about anything they've ever done is in some way, I think, articulating a version of what we're talking about here.
Right.
Is a sense of self, a sense of purpose that comes, that is accessed through, you know, simultaneously with suffering, or is accessed through doing hard things, going through hard stuff.
Yeah.
And in that way, it's why calling is often described as a thing you can't not do for reasons you can't fully understand, but are nonetheless compelling.
Mm-hmm.
That it both fulfills me and also is anchored to, in many ways, a sense of loss. Like even you talk to folks that yeah, that are following their calling, and some of them will even, you know, I've heard them discuss, like, they grieve for a life that they thought they would have before they felt or experienced a sense of calling.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think, honestly, I think Mother Teresa actually talks about these in her journals.
Oh,
These
really?
ideas. Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
think she had some pretty incredible journal entries, or diary entries, that we found after her death, where she talked about just how, um, maybe like how she has this feeling at times that she's missing out, or she's doubting what she's doing,
Mm-hmm.
because she could be living in a million different ways and still be doing good, right? It's not like it's not like Mother Teresa would be worthless,
Right.
but it wouldn't be her calling. It wouldn't be
Right.
authentic to her voice, which is, and this will be the last thing I'll say, and then I'll quit going on, but which is why the question is not, what is my calling? And the question is not, am I living out my calling? The question is, what do I do with myself? Or what is the calling asking me about myself? It's
Yes.
not external, and it's not cerebral. It's not knowledge. What is it? And it's not action oriented, like, am I doing it? It's about identity.
Yes.
The real question is, what do I do with myself, or what is this thing telling me about myself?
Yeah. And so you're faced with two choices from the beginning. Either these people, either anyone who claims that they're called is delusional, and there's no real, your conscience is just sort of an evolutionary construct that has sort of it's gone a little overboard. Your super ego is a little too developed, and people are mistakenly experiencing grief in terms of God sending them in a certain direction.
Or they're
Okay.
using calling to fabricate meaning out of their
Yes.
grief, right?
Yes.
To try to find a reason.
Yeah. So, which would essentially be that there's no such thing as calling. There's no
Right.
such thing as the daimon. It's just sort of an illusion. Or that it's a universal archetype, that this is a universal experience. Calling is archetypal. We all have this part of ourselves that is speaking to us, that's trying to tell us something about ourselves. And if you fall into the latter, if you take the position of the latter, you're talking about this is where Freud said the purpose of life is to make the unconscious conscious. What he was saying is what we're essentially is the process we're essentially describing, where there's parts of me that I'm disconnected to. There's a voice inside of me that I'm not in touch with. There's some part of me that wants me to be moving in a certain direction, that wants me to be experiencing certain things. And so it's a matter of hearing that's where you get into that's where you get into dream analysis, and that's where you get into psychotherapy, and that's where you get into all the experiments that Jung would run on himself. Like Jung would hold a pencil up to his forehead when he would fall asleep, and then when he fell asleep, he'd drop the pencil, obviously, and the noise of the pencil hitting the floor would wake him up. And so then he would journal whatever he was thinking when the pencil woke him up. And what he's trying to do is to get in touch with his own voice, the voice of the unconscious, the voice that he's repressed. That's his own unique. It's his soul, really. He's trying to get in touch with his soul. He's trying to understand what his soul is telling him. And the daimon is, it can be, you could call it the soul, the spirit, his own. What is my own spirit calling me? Who is my own spirit calling me to be? Who am I? Because I've repressed so much in order to survive, in order to survive and thrive in the world, that I'm pushing down parts of me that would, hinder my progress. Well, now I've got to get back in touch with those parts of myself that I've pushed down. And that's the process of, it's another way of thinking about and experiencing your calling, is you're getting in touch with those parts of yourself that are moving you in a different direction than you would be. Like we said earlier, calling has to be something that you're not, it has to be a path that you're not currently walking on. And the part of your unconscious, your unconscious is confirming, or it's either confirming or alarming you that you're either on the right path or the wrong path. And the word that we use to describe that feeling, that experience, is calling. Is I awaken to this sense that I'm not on the path that I should be on, and I feel like I should be different in the world. I should be a different person. I should be expressing myself differently than I am. And that's what Jung and Freud would say is discovering, is making the contents of the unconscious conscious. And we would say that's the call, that's hearing your calling and following your calling. But it's really in the way you say it, which I think is best, is it's becoming the called version of yourself. It's becoming your true self.
Yeah. Because people that hear or have some idea of their calling, right, that have this experience, the vast majority of them follow it.
Mm-hmm.
It is compelling for them, and in some way they follow it. It's like the tiny minority of folks that actually don't. right? And we talked about those folks at the beginning. Um, so what that means for me is that it's not a calling if it's something that I hear and I'm able to just shrug my shoulders and disregard.
Right.
To hear or to know your calling is to be transformed, is to become a person then that is called toward something.
Mm-hmm.
So it takes you into yourself, not away from yourself.
Yes.
That's and I think when we were talking about grief and suffering, that's one of the roles of suffering, is that it takes us beneath the routines of life. It takes us further into ourselves. And I think I may be overreaching here, but I'm just going to go with it. Um, I think that what we're talking about is like a metaphor for the incarnation, in a sense, in that what is a claim of the incarnation? It's that in order to access the divine, you have to go through your humanity. You have to go
Yes.
through humanity rather than the other way around. The divine is not an escape from our humanity. It actually makes us more human.
Yes.
Um, and so what we're talking about here when we talk about these like big ideas or this sense of soul, or right, getting in touch with, with your spirit, it's I don't think it's really that weird to anybody that thinks the incarnation has a claim to truth.
Right.
I think it still
Well,
works.
yeah. Well, that's why there's so many different ways to talk about it that are
Hmm.
all that all that are that all point you in the same direction. Because whether it's God or whether it's your unconscious, Jung's point is it might as well be God, because it exerts that same
Yeah.
power
Yeah.
over you, and it makes you if you stay in it, if you go deeper in it, it makes you more of who you are. It makes you the highest version of you. If you deny your calling, if you resist, it cuts you off from the deepest parts of yourself. You become disassociated. You become a less realized version of yourself. And to Jung's point, if you continue to do that, you lose access completely to the deepest, truest parts of your soul, of your psyche.
Yeah.
If you don't live in that calling, that's the neuroses, is that you can't, from there, you can't access those parts of if you don't experience that grief, if you don't listen and hear the voice from within, then you lose you basically you forfeit your soul. You don't have access. And I don't mean in the eternal heaven and hell form. I mean in the here and now. Like you forfeit the joy, the human experience of being in the world and being your true self. You're disassociated. You got two different people living inside of you that aren't integrated.
So does that add new meaning to Jesus saying, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world but forfeit his soul, or to lose his soul, in the sense that if a calling compels us to
Wow.
risk and to sacrifice, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And what does it profit someone to refuse to risk or refuse to follow their calling,
Refuse
and
to
gain the whole
sacrifice.
world and yet never access their soul?
Yep. And forfeit is the perfect word,
Huh.
because you just
Yeah.
you voluntarily, you gave it up. You traded it.
Yeah.
for to avoid sacrifice. You gave away that part of your humanity. You gave away that part of your experience in the world, the joys of sacrifice and what that ultimately brings. Which that's that hits perfectly.
Yeah.
Well, dude, I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, I'd say so.
This was a good one. And I appreciate all the hard work and insight that you've put into this. You're really onto something important.
Yeah, man. I mean, I hope so. Thanks. It's been 4.5 years of my life, so I hope so.
Yeah, I think you're
Yeah.
looking at this from a perspective that um, is not is high is rare. This is a rare. You're giving a rare, deep look into this really meaningful experience that people just don't ordinarily. And you're giving language to that experience that people haven't been able to express. So well done.
Yeah, yeah, man. I appreciate it. Um, Look, next week, I do really want to talk about how each Enneagram number may experience a sense of calling, what that might look
Yes.
like.
Yeah.
So let's pick up on that in our next conversation.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that would be good. All right,
That'd be
man.
fun. All right, dude. See you.
See ya.